Hey everyone, my name's Astor Joyce. I am a former student of Hershey Montessori, and I am presently a trainee in the IMTI Adolescent Guide, Montessori Adolescent Guide Training Program. And today I want to talk to you about materials in the Montessori world and consumerism. So, to me, the focus of Montessori is to give tools to growing individuals to enable them to follow their human tendencies and to adapt to the world around them and to adapt the world to meeting their needs and allowing them to fulfill their tendencies, right? That's the core of it. It doesn't have anything to do with like teaching specific information. It doesn't have anything to do with teaching specific belief. It is about It is about giving the individual the capability to teach themselves what they feel is necessary to live in this world. And how does this tie into consumerism? So, I recently learned that it takes about $30,000, probably a bit more with all the inflation and everything going on now, but about $30,000 to properly set up I forget if it was elementary or I forget if it was a first or second plane classroom. It's probably about this. I think it was second plane. So for non-Montessori people, we are talking ages 6 to 12. A classroom for ages 6 to 12, which would be like first through sixth grade. And the materials you are supposed to, right? The optimal, right, which is to say you're supposed to do this if you can, right? These are very beautiful materials. They're crafted in an ethical, in theory, an ethical manner. I haven't, like, that's what they say on their website. I haven't been to any of their factories or manufacturing points, so I couldn't tell you. Sustainable resources, high quality materials, this and that. However, you are now putting a very high barrier to entry to achieving the goal, which is giving growing individuals, children, adolescents, the tools they need to survive in this world. And by gatekeeping it this way, you are pretty much ensuring that only wealthy people are going to have access to these kinds of resources. So I think there needs to be a change in the Montessori culture. While these are like the lab standard materials, right? Because this is a scientific endeavor. We have done research and we've said, well, these materials produce the best results. The real world is not a laboratory, and children should not be raised in one. It creates a very confusing experience for when they get out into the real world. Ask me how I know. So I'm going to show you something that I made, right? And this was just like a little side project for me because I wanted to test the idea of how do you introduce thinking about time in different ways as part of cosmic education. If there's questions about that, I can go in it. But it's basically you're as a tool for the growing individual, you are showing them how all of the information in the world is linked together. And you can move between those links and you can draw those connections. And so you learn about something in one field and you can see it applied in another, right? So it usually starts with natural cycles, right? We talk about the creation of the universe, we talk about the coming of life and its development, then the coming of humanity and its development, and you can see how all of those factors play into one another and influence one another, and that's how we get the world we have. So, something that's very common in in the Montessori classroom is timelines because they are very useful for showing the progression of things, right? So here's what I've made for that. I've made a timeline, and this is a very basic timeline. of like the propagation and life cycle of a tree, right? So this was inspired by, I was taking care of a baby bird at the time, and they like to eat buckthorn berries. So this is inspired by that. So we start with the bird poops out a seed, the tree, the seed sprouts and the tree is born, it grows, and then it matures and it creates its own berries, and the tree dies, and a bird who's eaten the berries goes off and poops and starts the cycle over again, right? And this is a timeline. And I also wrote a little story/song that goes along with it, because stories are a great way of imparting information to people. So this is already familiar to someone in a Montessori classroom as a timeline. Events happen sequentially as time progresses. Great. And then I have this more simplified chart that shows the cycle, right? Bird poops, tree is born, tree grows, tree matures, tree dies, bird poops, and so on and so forth, right? Pretty easy. Montessori kids at this age would also have been familiar with this because they would have seen charts for like the water cycle, or maybe the carbon cycle, or the life cycle of an insect, right? Very similar: egg, larva, pupa, maturity, mates, eggs, like that kind of cycle, right? So these are two concepts that they're already familiar with. And then we can combine them, right? So this is showing how different, you can map the cycle to the timeline and show how multiple timeline events, right, can happen. So like within one cycle, so like the main line is the one cycle, right? That's the first timeline we looked at. And you can see how each point on this timeline is actually a different point on the cycle, and that the cycle can, you can start a new cycle based off of this, right? Right. The tree doesn't have to die before a new tree is born, right? That's kind of the idea. And then you can also map it out as a sine wave, because a sine wave is just a circle over time. So place in the cycle, time. And these are all the same points. Bird poops, tree is born, tree matures, tree dies, bird poops, that whole cycle. Tree grows, I think that was one of the ones I had in there. So I was very happy with this. And I showed it to some of my cohort during training, and they were all very impressed with it. And they said it was wonderful, and they said to keep working on it. And this kind of struck me as something odd. Like, what else is there here to keep working on? I have effectively presented a lesson, right? I have distilled the idea to its fundamental points. I like to say fundamental lesson, but in training we say key lesson because you're giving them a key to open the doors themselves, right? Fundamental lesson, you're giving them the foundation to build off of themselves. Same idea. So I've presented the key lesson of that you can view time in multiple ways, and that we already do. We view in cycles and linearly, and that you can put those two together, right? Like that's, I guess, 3 key lessons in there, right? One for each type of time. And I've done this using a drawing I whipped up in, 10, 15 minutes, right? This is also a drawing I could have done while giving the lesson. And they talk about this is how Montessori was originally taught, which was you would sit down with whatever individual you're teaching or you're working with, because again, we're not teaching things, and you would present the idea and you would draw a helpful chart or diagram or whatever it was to help visualize and create a concrete reference for the abstract idea, right? Now what do we do? Now you go to your Montessori store and you buy your charts, right? And people say, oh, it's so much work, I have to draw them myself if you don't do that, right? And you have this wonderful, beautiful, manufactured object in your classroom that you could whip out anytime you want to give this lesson. And to me, that feels antithetical, because what you are missing when you do that is you are missing the lesson of this is how you convey information to people, right? You are no longer teaching them the ability to sit down and draw out a chart themselves, to do that, right? And you get a little bit more of that as they get older and you get into the adolescent program where they're starting to do their own, their projects are getting, the standard is getting higher, the expectations of what you are capable of doing is getting higher, and so you do end up starting to draw charts and whatnot, but that's not consistently demonstrated throughout the entirety of training, right? So to tie this all back together, I'm going to switch back to my faith. Okay, so the point is, I think that there is too much gatekeeping in the Montessori world behind specific correct methodology, right, and use of proper materials and resources. Because almost no one in this world is going to have access to that. Like, I was really lucky and went to one of the best Montessori schools in the world. Maybe the best, right? Like, especially in regards to the adolescent program. Like, this, when it was created, this was groundbreaking. And it's been the model for the other adolescent programs that have come since. And that's wonderful. But it's not useful in the sense of creating the cultural shift that Maria Montessori talks about in her lectures, right? In this envisioning of the new world of where people can get along because we all have critical thinking skills and like the ability to like parse information and construct our own understandings of the universe in a logical fashion. All right, and have this sense of solidarity and human connectedness and interdependence and all the important stuff that is needed to create a better world. And then so you have organizations like AMI and AMS that say, well, I don't know, I shouldn't talk about AMS because I'm not familiar with any of their programs. But at least in AMI and the scuttlebutt I've heard is it's very gatekeepy. It's very, we must do it exactly as was not even written down by Maria Montessori because other people wrote down what she said, right? This is the the analogies to the or the comparisons to the Bible are astounding and a little concerning sometimes. But I'm getting off track. This is what happens when you don't have a script. The point being, I shouldn't need to pay $1,200 for glass bead for the beadwork setup, right? You can demonstrate that same information in the process of constructing that, right? And the children you are working with will love to get their hands on something like that. Like we talk about how like they will be so totally engrossed in a seemingly meaningless repetitive task because they are learning. Well, if they want to string 1,000 beads together to make a cube, like 10 cubed, they will do that, right? You don't need to pay $1,200 to give them that experience. You know, so and the other thing that this, because here's the big thing that this teaches, is it teaches or gives them the understanding that they can create the tools they need to succeed, that they can modify their environment for their benefit. Because in my experience, going through Montessori the way I did, where the environment was totally prepared for me, I think it creates a sort of learned helplessness of I can't change my environment because it's already prepared perfectly. Why would I bother? Why would I need to learn how to do that? Because it's already done. And as you get older, as you get into the adolescent program, that changes a little, right? Because now we're including the adolescents in the social organization. And as in being included in that social organization, you get to have a little bit of influence, right? So like as an adult, you still are preparing the environment because you have an idea of like, okay, being able to visualize numbers is really handy. So we should have some material, some way of allowing them to do that. And now either you can sit down and you can make your own beadworks, right? Even while class is going on, you're observing, maybe you take a few notes and you have that some of that downtime where you're not supposed to be doing anything because all your charges are doing what they're doing their work and they're self-constructing, right? Well, what are you doing? Maybe string some beads, right? Maybe cut out some paper to make the inserts. They won't be metal inserts or insets, but you can create a material that both isolates the fine motor control and helps them visualize shapes and the relation of shapes. Right? You can do that. And not only can you do that, your students can do that. Right? They have the capability to create their own materials. And I think this is especially important as our systems of economics continue to collapse and as American imperialism continues to implode. Nobody's going to have money for a $30,000 classroom setup. It's just not, you know? And the people who aren't the people who need the extra help that Montessori gives, right? Because they're doing fine. They're coasting on millions or whatever, right? Like if you can afford to do that. This needs to be accessible to everyone. And I think a big part of that is teaching or like giving out the information, not even teaching, just having the information openly available of this is what this material seeks to isolate. These are the properties this material tries to convey, right? So Pink Tower, that conveys weight and scale, and it is an introduction to similarity, right? Because it's all one color, so it's isolated. They're all cubes, so that's isolated. But they're different. They're all similar, right? Because they're all cubes, but they're different sizes. They have different weights. So you are introducing similarity to like a 4-year-old or 5-year-old or whatever, right? I'm adolescent trained. I'm not first plane trained. So you can probably do that with some cans, right? You get your little can that your tomato paste came in, and you get maybe a bigger can that some beans came in, and then maybe even a bigger can that some crushed tomatoes came in, or like a fruit medley came in, right? Those are all different. They're all cans are gray. You take the packaging off. Cans are gray. They're all the same shape. They're different. They're all similar, right? It is conveying the exact same properties. But then this also has the benefit of these are found objects in your environment. These are objects that are immediately relevant to the learning individual. And this will give them a better ability to adapt to their environment, right? Because we're using objects that are already familiar, right? But they're still getting the abstract principle of similarity. And so if this child was then to come into a properly constructed Montessori classroom and they saw a pink tower, I bet you money that they would instantly know the purpose of that tower. They'd be like, this is like the cans I had at home. Or like this is the cans I had in Miss Astor's like fucking trash built school, right? Because the principles would be linked, right? Because these are both things that are trying to teach similarity using this tower of shapes. So I think that should be part of Montessori training, is how do we take the principles we have learned from these materials we have created, from all this research and study that has gone into this pedagogy, and how do we make it more accessible, right? Like, what are the fundamentals that we have isolated here, and how do we translate that into immediate, everyday stuff? Because, like, this is going to be, because, like, I think homeschooling is going to get really important, or community education, where people are going to stop sending their kids to public school, or stop sending them to private school because they don't have the money, right? And you're going to have that unemployed, disabled person, hi, who like can't go work at the capitalism factory to bring home money, but still wants to contribute something to their community. Well, I can go get the cans out of my pantry, and I can go find some scrap sheet metal to cut out some metal inserts, and I can hand draw a quick note while I'm giving a lesson to give the same quality of education, the same kind of tools in a real world environment. It is incredibly important to do that, to bring about the world that Maria Montessori envisioned. Because it's that, I mean, it's adapting the philosophy and the pedagogy to our time and to our place, which is like what she's all about. It's all about that adaptation, right? And following those human tendencies. So, next time you see a shiny material you really want for your classroom, or you see a random person who is in need of a key, don't wait. Don't buy something. Make it. Find it. It exists, right? It exists out there, because all of these tendencies that like these materials are informed by for their design is like just stuff humans have been doing. So we've been interacting with it since we've been humans, and it's just Maria Montessori has kind of like collected it all in one place and said, hey, it'd be really efficient if we just did all this training here, you know, instead of like keeping kids locked in cages. You don't need a classroom. The world is your classroom, right? The world is what we are learning about. You do not need to like, people need to be in the world. People are in the world, and putting them in labs to train them causes problems and isn't going to bring about the change you hope to see. And it's really just perpetuating that capitalist, consumerist culture that evolved from the horrendous stuff Maria Montessori witnessed during the World Wars. You know, and the thing she warned us about and told us to fight against. So, yeah. Consumerism, well, the revolution will not be televised. Peace will not be bought through consumerism. Yeah, there you go. This got really long-winded. I'm sorry. I can't stand to write scripts. I'm going to try and edit this down. Anyways, thanks for watching. Love one another. Love yourself. Hope you learned something. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.